It's my pleasure now to introduce a further panel session. So I'm going to ask my panelists, three panelists, to come up onto the stage and to join me up here if they would like to take their seats, and then we'll introduce them. There was one other further piece of information I was just fed during the course of that last presentation by Mina. We've just passed the 1,000th person entering the conference, during the rest of the session. So 1,000 people physically are here, in the design center. So that's a great, sign, for that. And well done to the organizers. So this panel session now is all around a key topic. It's all around alternative ways to pay, alternative payment options. And I think this is, for those of you who've listened to some of the sessions already this morning, is a common theme that we've been hearing. We're hearing about the choice, around the options, for that. But so we're going to explore that with our panelists. Firstly, unfortunately, Adrian Smythe from NatWest is unable to be with us as scheduled because unfortunately he's gone down sick this morning. But we've got three great panelists, and it just means they'll be able to have more chance for you to ask questions. So what I'm going to do now is ask each of our three panelists to introduce themselves, the organization they represent, just so you can understand who things. So, Diana, would you like to introduce yourself, and then we'll go down the line?
Sure, thank you. So I'm Diana Carrasco. I've got, you wouldn't say, but I've got 20 years experience in payments. I've worn many hats throughout my career, and I suppose the common theme across all my different roles has been innovation and consumer, or innovation at the service of the consumer. I've also been fortunate enough to spend a few years in the retail side of business, in digital retail. So I've came back to merchant services with a 360-degree view. So we now can design merchant services with our consumers in mind, but our consumers, customers in mind. So our customers, consumers in mind as well. Sorry for that. It was a bit of a jigsaw. I've had many advisory roles throughout my career as well, with the public and the private sector. The one I'm most proud of is the one I did in helping protect children online, and I've been also a guest lecturer for University of Cambridge for their executive programs. My current role is as MD for Merchant Services for Lloyds. Lloyds is going through a major period of growth and innovation in merchant services, and I've been tasked with the not-so-easy transformation, radical transformation,
Sounds like a big challenge.
Yeah, of our merchant services, particularly around gateway services and our partnerships and third-parties ecosystem. And finally, I'm also non-executive director for Wirex Limited.
Well, we're delighted to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank
Jack,
you.
Would you like to introduce yourselves to the audience?
Yeah, my name's Jack Wilson. I'm the head of public policy at TrueLayer. We're an open banking payments company, and we facilitate things like paying for cars with Kazoo. I've been in payments for about 10 years now. I joined the Payments Council, which was the UK trade body for bank payments first, and then moved on to the Payment Systems Regulator to help set that up, and then led work to implement the Payment Services Directive for the UK Financial Conduct Authority. So payments is in my blood.
Peter, last but not least.
Peter Mødlerma, heading up our solution consultant team at ACI Worldwide. I have Europe-wide responsibility for our e-commerce, fraud, and omnichannel solution. And together with my team, we're helping merchants, payment orchestrators, as well PSPs, really to leverage and gain obviously access to a variety of payment methods. And at the same time, we help them really to address the challenges in the market, which is sell more, lose less, and be able to drive more business forward. At ACI, we span quite across the digital payment quite a bit. Maybe not all of you are aware. So ACI we are serving top of the 19 banks worldwide. We have around 1,500 customers in the fraud domain, means on the banking side, as well on the merchant and processor side, as well as we're serving give or take around 80,000 merchants either directly or through PSPs, which we empower. ACI itself, we are not a merchant acquirer, we're not a processor, we are a software company. And we handle, I think, in the global scale, last figures was around 17 trillion transactions a year. So quite a bit. And I think kind of back to your initial thought is APM, why we are here. And I just want to give one thought to what you started off is like about choice. I think the most important thing is kind of customers demanding choice, and payment becomes a really differentiator as we move forward.
Thank you very much, and I think you'll see, backing up my point, is what an experienced set of speakers we got here, and from diverse organizations for them. And so I thank them very much for that. I've got a few questions I'm going to ask our panelists first, but there will also be the opportunity for you, both online and also here in the audience, to pose questions. So please do take that opportunity. Think of those killer questions to really stretch their knowledge or whatever, and to make sure. So we'll be coming to you either with a microphone or online via Slido to ask your question. So please do take that opportunity. But before we get there, let's kick things off. And really, we're talking about alternative ways to pay. Let's unpick that to start with. What do you really consider to be an alternative way to pay? What do you consider to be an alternative way to pay? Peter, why don't you start us off with this one?
And probably I see the clock is ticking 35 minutes. Probably we will not be able to obviously answer that question really in 35 minutes. But let me try to do a brief one. In my world, obviously, and obviously in our world, alternative payment methods are basically what I consider anything which is not like having a card in hand, tapping at the point of sale or in face-to-face environment, or typing in the credit card number into an online form. That's kind of anything else I would consider not as being an APM. It's kind of probably, it spans from a digital wallet, virtual currency, bank transfer. It even goes into things like Apple Pay and Google Pay. You can argue about that, but I think still for me, kind of this is an alternative way, clearly in that domain.
Jack, do you agree, or do you have a different definition of an alternative way to pay?
I'll come in with a contrary view, which is that alternative payments are anything other than cards, whether that's offline, like you mentioned, or online. So, cards have been online for a long time now, and the wave of alternatives are alternatives at the e-commerce checkout. So, like the PayPals, the Klarnas, the BNPL. That's what I think of in the sphere of alternative ways to pay.
Diana, at Lloyds, how do you view this?
Well, if you think about it, all ways to pay have been born as an alternative to what was there before, and they have been born with consumer convenience in mind. So it was 1950 that Frank McNamara forgot his wallet when he went for his club to have a dinner with their friends. So he left his business card as a guarantee and came back the day after. And that's how the first credit card was born. It was 1979 that Michael Aldridge was tired of going to the shops with his wife and said to the wife, wouldn't it be nice if we were just sitting here watching telly and we could order from the television? So he created what they called the teleshopping. And 3 years later, the first e-commerce business was built. It was actually a marketplace, business computer exchange for people that wanted to sell their computers they no longer needed. And since then, everything has been an alternative, adding alternatives from chip and pin to contactless to e-commerce as we know it now, QR codes, pay by link, unified commerce. So I'd say it depends, right? It's an alternative to what? And the good thing or the beauty about all this payments ecosystem we all live and breathe is that none of these payment methods have disappeared. They all coexist very nicely. So I think I'm going to be a bit controversial here, and I'd say that rather than talking about alternative payment methods, we should talk about payment alternatives in the spirit of choice we were talking before.
I personally think that rather than alternative, maybe we should be using the word appropriate.
Exactly.
The appropriate payment method, because it will vary, and also it will vary, I think, by age, by demographic, by geography, by preference, but there are a variety of options. But But really, which ones of these methods are growing fastest? Diana, which of these APMs are you seeing with the greatest growth rate?
Okay, so when the first credit card was created in 1950, my mom was 2 years old. When the first e-commerce business was created in 1979, I was 2 years old. It took a generation for the next big thing to happen. Now, with the evolution of technology, particularly around the digital space, everything's going so fast. Everything's growing fast. What it's I suppose hype now may not be hype in a few months or a few years, right? And we're saying we don't know what's going to be the next big thing, and that's super interesting. So it's very difficult to say. I'd say that keeping in mind that all the alternatives to what we were using to pay before have been grown with consumer convenience in mind, we should focus on what it's that consumers are demanding in terms of convenience now. And for me, this is whenever I want, wherever I want. So I would say probably the ones that are going to carry on growing and that we will see more spin-offs of are, on the one hand, unified commerce that will allow customers to jump from one channel to another smoothly, say buy online, return in store, and the evolution of that. I'd say probably QR codes that also have the different aspects of safety, fastness, and reliability. I would say...
I think we heard that from David Jones earlier on.
We did, didn't we? Yes, exactly. I think that's not going anywhere. This pay by link, I suppose, is one I keep an eye on because it removes the hassle of having to go into the merchant's website, search, go on Google, search the website to make a payment. It's all very convenient, comes to you. And then I would say anything that removes the hassle of having to remember your payment details or entering them, whether that's the traditional card on file, wallets, or open banking. So I'd say that's probably the 4 trends my bets on.
Jack, the growth you're seeing?
Well, before talking about growth, I was just going to answer a point made before. What are we talking about? An alternative to what? And I think if we talk about card payments, then the alternative is to costly ways to pay for the merchant. Anything up to 3% is what a merchant is paying to process a card payment. Insecure, arguably, you have to share long card details with merchants, and that inevitably leads to leakages of that data, which leads to fraud downstream and unauthorized payments. And the UK has a big problem with £500 million of unauthorized payments, and also cumbersome now. We've been talking about the history of cards. It was kind of invented for physical transactions, in a dining room. And it's not really adapted very smoothly to an e-commerce world, to an online world. And you can see that in the major struggle that card issuers had and merchants had in adopting the new security features of strong customer authentication.
Yeah, I've got the scars myself from that, yeah.
It took years and delay after delay, and the regulator giving forbearance to the card issuers to have more time to implement. And now we're finally, after the 14th of March deadline passed, we're getting emails saying, after this has been implemented, you might have your card declined. The merchants are working to fix this, but so it's now become a cumbersome way of paying because of the new security features. And so my favorite alternative, as you could probably tell, is open banking, which was built at the outset of the new security requirements. So it has that built from the beginning, and it's really a smooth process of biometric authentication. Open banking payments are just direct, faster payments from a consumer to a merchant. So they're much cheaper. They can be provided at around the 1% mark. So very much framed in my mind is what we're talking about, an alternative to cards, and what are the alternatives.
Thank you. And Peter, obviously, ACI, big international payment provider. So touch us on this variation you see around the world, and what does alternative payments mean in your view, and why are you seeing, what variations are you seeing?
No, definitely, absolutely. There's a huge difference between the different markets. I want to pick a few examples, maybe just outline what I mean with that is, if you look at let's take the German market as an example, obviously. When you look online, consumers are paying basically with their banking app, or they basically the bank account. They're using, obviously, Sofort now, part of Klarna, or they use, obviously, very strong, obviously, PayPal. So this kind of card payment in that world is not really known. Girocard is probably an equivalent of that, but in general, kind of classical Visa, MasterCard, probably not there. Very similar, but very different, I think, is, for example, the Netherlands. Again, bank transfer, but if you don't understand how Ideal works, there's no way that you sell there. It is. The same is another good example I'd like to pick is Poland. Still smaller market, growing quite rapidly. Same there, open banking, bank transfer. Obviously, if you don't understand P24 or you don't know what Blink is, it becomes a challenge there. And obviously, even in the UK market, very card-centric market, still kind of obviously Apple Pay, Google Pay, as I would count them into alternative, are very relevant. And the same applies for PayPal. So I think the markets differ very much. And I would like to add one thing or two more things on that. Demographic, very important. You need to understand who is your audience. It's very different if consumers shop in the mid-20s, mid-40s, or mid-60s. Very fundamental difference. And as well, kind of, you need to understand what type of shopper you have. Is it somebody who comes the first time, or is it a regular returning one? You need to address the needs and challenges and be able to really fulfill their ask at the end of the day, or choice.
Peter, you mentioned Apple Pay and Google Pay in there. Are those alternative ways to pay? Jack, what do you think? Is that an alternative, or is that just...
I just see Google and Apple as like a wrapper around the traditional card payment, and they don't do much other than embed a card payment into your Google and Apple experiences. They do remove a bit of friction, but that comes at a cost to the merchant, because on top of all the other contingent costs of accepting cards, you have the fee towards Google and Apple. So not really an alternative payment method.
And Diana, from the bank's perspective, you've obviously been looking at your customers, whether the consumers and the merchants. But what are they telling you they're wanting, and why are alternatives becoming more popular?
Well, I'd suppose that there's the one size never fits all. Yeah. So even we've talked about different generations, different people, but even the same person in different circumstances in the same merchant will have a different need or a different demand for choice. For example, with the pandemic, people have moved toward remote payment more than they were doing before, some of them. And even before some people were ready, or that was not necessarily the channel of choice, they've been sort of forced into that. So for example, let's think of the 2 million consumers in the UK that have low or very low digital skills, and that's a fact. In the pandemic, they have been forced into buying online because there was no other option for many basic needs, and they still do 14% of their shopping online. So if you imagine what we have to think of as an industry is to provide the merchants with what they need and what their customers are going to need. And in this case, for example, and this is just an example, it's making it easy for consumers to transact online, whether their abilities are in the digital space are up here, in the middle, or they're low. And that drives the need for what we call unified commerce. And I was talking about that before a little bit, which is basically allowing the consumer to jump from one distribution channel to another, online, telephony, face-to-face, even for the same transactions sometimes, and to use a diverse range of payments, be that traditional cards, whether it's wrapped into wallets or not, open banking for convenience, fraction their payment in different installments, a request to pay, etc. So I would say customers are demanding, to your question, customers are demanding being able to move across the channels, that to be smooth, and the merchants to be able to follow them as well, and to understand if what they've bought online they want to return in store, and make that easy for them, and then a range of options for paying, including traditional, alternative, or whatever it's to see.
So if consumers are moving across channels and things, Peter, what does that mean from the technology is concerned?
Yeah, that's because this fun part.
This is easy to introduce a new method, but can you just put it on one channel? Do you have to put it everywhere? And how do you join it all together?
No, definitely. That's, I think on the one side, definitely a challenge, but I think on the other side, as Diana alluded to, I think that's what the market is demanding and consumers are expecting to have.
Yeah.
It's like kind of, I can start somewhere. I think a good example is always the buy online, pick up in store example. I think that's kind of very important, and to be able to basically, I think these things very traditional before we had card present, card not present, or face-to-face environment. He thinks these channels get more blurry, and then kind of obviously how they engage on the, is it a QR code, is it kind of scan and go, is it pay in aisle, kind of, I think all of you have probably experienced this one. These things are getting more blurry, so I think from a technology, obviously kind of you need to enable these kind of, I think, transition between the different, call it channels or even distribution ways or consumers, how they engage with you. You need to enable this one.
Yeah, one of the European merchants I work with from consultancy side, during the pandemic, they suddenly realized their car park was one of their most important sales channels. They hadn't thought about that before, but thank God they'd invested in the technology to enable them to be able to take the payments from the car park. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to. But Jack, tell us more about the rising in popularity and and what the benefits are from these alternatives.
So, I mean, I've mentioned earlier the benefits of open banking payments. What they really do is bring the bank transfer forwards into the retail space. Previously, bank transfers have just been the reserve of sending money to your mates, or maybe paying a builder and doing a manual bank transfer online. But there's now the regulatory framework for third-party providers like TrueLayer to step forwards and actually plug merchants into that instant bank transfer method. And that's really what's now giving that extra level of choice to the merchant. So, not only can the merchant offer your traditional cards, your traditional buy now, pay later, PayPal, there'll be, in that series of blocks that you get at the bottom of the payment page, there'll be bank transfers, not just tons and tons of BNPL, like ClearPay, Afterpay, all of these guys. I mean, that's the dream anyway. And I think you talk about popularity. There is a big job to be done to sort out what the consumer chooses when they're at the checkout. I don't think we're at the stage yet where consumers are seeing many bank transfer options in the UK. Like you said, these are 10 a penny in Germany and in the Netherlands, but really there is a test of whether popularity of bank transfer can be increased.
Thank you, Jack. At the beginning of this session, I did say there's an opportunity for each of you to ask questions to our speakers. I hope you've been preparing those, because we'll be bringing the microphones to you in a second, or you can be typing them, if you're online, into the Slido. So do make sure you've got your questions, and we'll bring those. But before we do that, one last question to our panelists from myself. So who are going to be the winners and losers? If all these changes are happening, if there's alternatives or change, Diana, who do you see as going to be the winners and losers?
Okay, so that's hard. Cash was already in the decline before the pandemic, and that's only accelerating.
Even in Germany, by the way.
Even everywhere, yeah. But also, we've been talking about the death of cash payments for 20 years now, and it hasn't happened. I don't think it will ever happen. But I think that there will be less and less cash payments. Cards are not going anywhere. They may be mutating, There may be, moving away from the rectangle plastic into something different. They may be evolving.
That sounds a good quote for the day.
Yeah.
Cards aren't going anywhere, they're just
Cards
mutating.
yeah, exactly, like energy. So they're actually, the system that enables card payments is so strong and so reliable that I don't really see it going anywhere. And cards have even been managed to be the enabler for crypto mainstream spending by the crypto and currency exchange companies doing that in the background and enabling a debit card on top of that. So the consumer is actually spending their crypto, but for the merchant, it's a transparent debit card, master Visa card, transaction, in their standard currency. But I have to say, I do agree that open banking is going to be a very, very serious contender, and we do have now enabled open banking, pay from bank in our payment gateway for our merchants. So I don't know, but if I have to pick one winner, I think it's going to be the consumer. And I dare to say probably the vulnerable customers are going to be the ones that are going to be the great winners of this alternative.
How about the
payments.
merchant?
Merchant as well. If the consumer wins, the merchant wins.
Okay. Jack, your thoughts on winners and losers?
I have very similar thoughts. When you introduce...
No, we want some differences.
But I'll come at it from a different angle. When you introduce competition into a system, there is price pressure, and that's what we're seeing now with bank transfer options being available through open banking. To buy a car is expensive. You're paying around 12 grand maybe for a used car. That's an extremely expensive card processing fee for the merchant. If they can undercut that significantly using a very cheap payment method like bank transfer, then they're going to have this big chunk of money that's left over, and they're in real competition with, Kazoo is in competition with Cinch and CarWow. They're all competing on price, and they're enabled to compete on price by cheaper payment methods, and ultimately the consumer's benefiting from that because their car's cheaper at the end of the day, and can be significantly cheaper through that cost saving. So again,
so Peter, do you see different winners or losers, or are you going to agree with our other two speakers?
No, I would agree. I would just add a little bit on that. I think one thing's for sure, competition creates innovation. I think we have seen that clearly over the last 2 years. Just probably all of us are familiar now with Buy Now, Pay Later. I think probably 3 years down the road, or kind of past 3 years, nobody knew about that one and had any clue about this one. At the end of the day, consumer will make a lot of the decision, obviously, drive it forward. And I just want to give a quick example where I thought, obviously, it made a difference in me as a consumer, how I choose how I would like to pay. Obviously, small family at home, obviously, dishwasher broke. Went online, Googled it, to fix it, found a YouTube video, nice link to a store, allowed me to go there. Never been there before in my life, obviously. They had the spare part. I think it was a €10 spare part, obviously. I got that spare part, and then obviously at the checkout, I had two choices. I can go down the route of put my details, where I live, who I am, what are my payment options, what is my credit card number, blah, 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 blah. Or I can choose obviously an alternative which said, click on that, log in, and all done. And that was clearly for me, as a consumer, I made the choice, that's the right choice. And even obviously in an environment, obviously the costs are not on me, but even if there would be a certain cost towards me as a consumer, probably spending on my smartphone, probably 5 minutes to enter all the stuff, and probably I will miss something there, I'm sure. Obviously made me clearly the choice, I want to go down that APM route. That was one drive of me.
So who wants to ask the first question to our speakers here? Raise your hands and we'll bring a microphone to you. Please can I ask you to introduce yourself and your company first so that the speakers know where the question is coming from.
Hi all, Alison Creech here from Global Payments. I'm interested to know how important consumer protection is in alternative ways to pay and how should it be achieved?
So the question was, how important is consumer protection? Diana, do you want to start with that one?
I think it's as important with alternative payment methods as it is with anything else, right? Consumers should be at the forefront, not just the consumer's money, but consumers' protection conduct, as we call it in the UK, should be beyond, I think, our basic not sell the wrong products to wrong people at the wrong price. It should be about caring for how we design our payment service provisions, how we build them, how the consumer is at the front and the end of everything that we do. And by consumer, we should be focusing not only on the consumers that are the most obvious, perhaps customers to what we're developing, but also actually any consumer, really.
So Jack, in the open banking world, where does consumer protection fit? Is it there? Is it still developing? What's your thoughts?
I mean, consumer protection's the most important thing. It's at the heart of the regulations that have facilitated open banking. I think you just have to look at the huge inconvenience and stress that's inflicted on UK consumers of both unauthorised transactions, which runs to £500 million a year, and also the scourge of authorised push payment scams, where consumers are making manual bank transfers and they're pushing money thinking that it's going to the right place, but it goes to a fraudster. So the way that open banking deals with that and the kind of inbuilt security is that, on the one hand, every payment is strongly authenticated, so there will not be unauthorized transactions in the same sense that card payments can be manipulated and you can lose your card details. And then, on the other hand, if you look at TrueLayer, we populate the payee details. We send the money directly to the payee who has a contract with us, so the consumer is not going to be defrauded into sending money to the wrong place. And so you've got a £1 billion fraud problem, which is addressable by open banking and the inbuilt security.
Thank you. We've got our next questioner here. If you can introduce yourself and your company.
Nancy McCaw, I'm an independent consultant. We've talked about each country sort of specialising in different areas of alternative payments, and also cash and potentially cards declining in use. So where does that leave the traveller who wants to go abroad and make payments if the payment, what payment options are available to them if you can't just go off with your card around the world?
So the question is, where does it leave the traveller? They're going around the world seeing all these different options which vary, instead of having a ubiquitous, experience today.
Yeah, and how do you pay for things in
Peter,
other countries?
your thoughts on this?
I think it goes back to what I said initially. Clearly, obviously, you need to understand, as a merchant, you need to understand your audience. It means kind of, obviously, if you're serving travelers, obviously, let's pick a very simple example. A Chinese traveler, obviously, you need to be able, obviously, to accept their preferred payment of choice, which is, obviously, you need to have heard about WeChat Pay. That's something you should have as a merchant. So definitely there is kind of, obviously, it's not the one-fits-all solution.
Maybe Alipay as well.
Sorry, say it again?
Alipay maybe as well.
Alipay, of course, as well. So I think it's important that you understand who is your audience, who are your customers, and then you, as a merchant, you need to make sure, obviously, you are able to accept what the consumer, again, back to our initial discussion, consumer choice, and consumer will drive the decision. So you need to obviously be able to accept what they are asking for versus the other way around, trying to push them down your route.
So one of the questions we've received online is, what's this going to mean to all the back office payment processes, with all these options? Who wants to stake us out? Jack?
Yeah, I was going to mention earlier that I think the payment gateways, the people that sit on the checkout have a really crucial part to play in. They are the gatekeepers of alternate payment methods. Traditionally, they've just offered card processing at the checkout, but increasingly they're looking to partner with BNPL open banking providers so that the consumer is faced with this choice. So I think they have a really crucial, they're almost like the kingmakers of alternative payment methods.
Do we have another question?
Hey, Tim Annis from Blue Chain. So we talked a lot about customer choice and appropriateness of transactions and also protecting the customer from fraud. How do you see request to pay supporting that? And I think it also fits into that operational piece as well.
How do you see
as an
request to pay?
amalgamation?
So, go on.
I think that request to pay is kind of being developed in parallel with payment initiation services, which do a very similar job. It's not clear to me why we need to create something from scratch in request to pay when you can use an open banking provider to send requests to pay. So I think there's a kind of a philosophical question. Do we need a whole new scheme around request to pay when you've spent the last 5 years building a really agile infrastructure of open banking that can do the same job?
Diana, your thoughts on request to pay?
Yeah, I partially agree. So it's request to pay is a payment initiated way to transact, right? I think limiting it to open banking is where it's the challenge, right? Because not everybody will necessarily want to choose open banking to pay. So it has to, in my view, have the different range of payment options, card, open banking, wallets, etc. But I think the question was more around fraud and how we protect fraud. We protect our customers from fraud. And I think that's a tricky one, because going back to, I know which of you were talking before about fraud and scams for customers. It's very easy, and it's kind of running now, like the tricking customers, scamming customers into do a payment to a utility bill provider with request to pay or with any other method, right? So it's around, I suppose, also a very relevant exercise of protecting our consumers by explaining and training and making them aware of the risks as well.
I think I see one final question from the floor.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me? Well? Yes. I really like the parts
Could you introduce yourself and your company first, please?
Sorry, Lina Fasiferi from Autorec. So my question is around what you said earlier about the different kind of payments and which one could be the big winner and the advantages. But to continue on that, I wanted to ask which one is most expensive for the provider? Or if we think of it of a number of electricity connections, which one is the most optimal and which one costs much more and need a higher number of people using it to make it even?
So the question is all about all the alternatives have different payment commercial terms. How does that impact things without getting into any specific scheme?
But definitely, they have different ones. I think I would like to flip the question still around is kind of how much it costs you kind of to get the consumer to obviously over the finishing line. I think that's something, is that helping you to convert or is that kind of disabling? There's probably not the silver bullet to answer that question. It's kind of, the answer is it depends. There is, of course, kind of obviously, I think the variety is obviously for everything which goes into lending, so buy now, pay later probably gives you, will increase customer spending, but at the same time probably is more expensive than a real straightforward, obviously, open banking transfer. So,
Jack, do you want to expand on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot that goes into buy now, pay later. The provider is taking on that risk of managing the defaults on the repayments. And so that's why they pass on a big charge to the merchant. But then on the flip side, it's worth it for the merchant because they're getting that throughput of goods. And then I suppose you've got the downside for the consumer of maybe buying that extra T-shirt that they didn't need, but that's BNPL.
Well, just time flies when we're having fun, and we've had a great discussion this morning around alternative ways to pay. Before we finish, what I'd like each of the speakers to do is to leave you with a closing thought on their perspective around that. Diana, would you like to kick us off?
I'd say it's crucial for merchants to think not of alternative payment methods, but about payment alternatives for the customers, and to think about what all of their potential customers is going to need at different points of their cycle.
Thank you very much. Jack, your closing thought?
Open banking is not finished. It's still a thing that's in development, and we still need additional, regulatory push to add the extra features and the extra convenience that consumers crave. So I would just say, it is something that will keep evolving and improving.
Peter, over to you.
Yeah. Alternative, I think, kind of is probably becoming more the standard in certain areas. I think it's important to understand in which market you want to sell, which demographic, what are the use case. And I think kind of at the end of the day, it's kind of about kind of how you convert your customers into actually buyers. I think that's really important to understand. And I think I think we talked about it, buy now, pay later is one of the things definitely we see. There's a lot of push in that domain, and I think definitely we'll see more to come.
I'd like to make you aware that the most recent issue of the Global Payments Report from WorldPay by FIS, which covers alternative payment methods, has just been released, and that gives a further explanation around some of the choices and the stats for each country. So if you've got particular interest, I think you'll find that a good data source for that. But I'd like each of you now to put your hands together and thank our speakers for a great discussion.
Thank you.